Hello! Lots of reading in this one, but this is the last section of class that will address ancient Greek rhetors directly. Moving forward, we'll continue to reference their ideas, but see how they can be applied to current situations and circumstances in our daily lives and society. Among other things, we're also taking our first big dive into Aristotle's writing by looking at On Rhetoric. And we'll discuss one of Plato's contemporaries, Socrates, as well. Socrates was also, as per his speech, against the sophist, but for different reasons. We will also talk about two important concepts, syllogisms and the enthymeme. These are key ideas in Aristotle's rhetorical theory, which he uses to further articulate his concept of logos, which is one of his three proofs. And by the way, if you haven't figured it out before, by the end of this lesson you will have a much better idea of how much Aristotle just loved categories. In fact, he also worked as a biologist, one of the first, if not the first, in history. So let's begin with some background and information about the Phaedrus by Plato. Today's keywords are enthymeme, premise, syllogism. The Phaedrus. So the Phaedrus is an interesting and kind of sprawling work, covering everything from categories of thought and rhetoric to love and even reincarnation. It's kind of a funny work in some ways just because it seems all over the map, and you may find yourself thinking, hey, did Plato end up talking about this? But here's a clue to unraveling the selections you read from the Phaedrus, in one line. Plato, through his sock puppet Socrates, states the following: "Then, my friend, he who knows not the truth, but pursues opinions, will, it seems, attain an art of speech which is ridiculous, and not an art at all." This can be taken, again, as Plato's call for the truth, big T truth, as we've referred to it, as the important deal, not the trickery or the cunning flattery of rhetoric in the weaker sense. Plato, again, is about the consistent forms of knowledge, the higher truth. In the Phaedrus, Plato also talks about the importance of categorizing types of address and types of speech, which is going to be a recurring theme in this lesson, if not the entire course. But this is because, in Plato's words, since it is the function of speech to lead souls by persuasion, he who is to be a rhetorician must know the various forms of soul. This is a way of saying, hey, forget about the cool punchlines and the tricks and the turns of phrases that the sophists might teach you. You need to know a horse from a donkey, and you need to learn the immutable knowledge, the knowledge of the soul. Think of it as an appeal to having a solid foundation. Numbers come up in Greek philosophy every now and then, and I think this is a good time to use them as a kind of example. Mathematicians and learning specialists tell people who have issues with math, like myself, not to get hung up on the advanced stuff. Don't add to the height of the house, if you will. In fact, I was told by a neuroscientist friend of mine to relearn math from the beginning, like preschool level, and they were right. The solid foundation was the key. This is similar to what Plato is stressing here. Plato says, the student of rhetoric must, accordingly, acquire a proper knowledge of these classes and then be able to follow them accurately with his senses when he sees them in the practical affairs of life. Otherwise, he can never have any profit from the lectures he may have heard. But note he also calls attention to another important part of speaking we've talked about in previous lessons, as we can see in the following excerpt, and has added thereto a knowledge of the times for speaking and for keeping silence, and has also distinguished the favorable occasions for free speech, or pitiful speech, or intensity, and all the classes of speech which he has learned. Then, and not till then, will his art be fully and completely finished. Now here's question 1. And yes, I will accept a short answer here, less than 150 words is okay. What term would describe what Plato is talking about here? Name it and define it. So the Phaedrus contains more shots at the sophistic approach from Plato, but it's also notable because its definition of rhetoric is slightly different than the one Plato offered before, and this is why we're reading it. In the Phaedrus, Socrates says, "Is not rhetoric in its entire nature an art which leads the soul by means of words, not only in law courts and the various other public assemblages, but in private companies as well? And is it not the same when concerned with small things as with great, and, properly speaking, no more to be esteemed and important than in trifling matters? Is this what you have heard?" Plato's text offers up 5 requirements for those who wish to be rhetoricians, which you can read at the end of our selections. They must know the truth, they must know the nature and types of men's souls, they must know the various types of speeches, they must know the relationships of types of speeches to types of souls, and they must know the relationship of situations to types of speeches. So that's the big thing here. Plato's perhaps giving a bit more of an ear to entertaining the idea of rhetoric, but he's still all about the dialectic. For Plato, dialectic is a superior art, and rhetoric is an inferior one. Dialectic must precede rhetoric, for rhetoric to be a true art. It seems unclear from reading the Phaedrus whether or not a true art of rhetoric is possible, given the requirements Socrates put forward in the text. So what about other philosophers and thinkers in ancient Greece who had an issue with the sophists? Enter Isocrates. That's Isocrates, and yes, I promise you'll get some new names to go over in the future. And no, this is not like an alter ego Socrates or something. So, Isocrates studied with Gorgias and other sophists, opened the first school of rhetoric in Athens, worked as a speechwriter, which we call a logographer, for people who were going to court, much like a sophist would. He was praised at the end of the Sophists, although some people argue this was a sarcastic gesture by Plato, and his writing was described as complex. It is rumored he had a weak voice, and thus preferred writing to actually speaking. However, he made a lot of serious cash as a teacher, and was really successful as an educator. Isocrates wrote against the Sophists around 390 BCE as a kind of publicity speech, like a written epidictic piece for his own skill. It rejects both the Platonic philosophical approach and the staid, stale approach of the people who are writing about universal solutions to speaking, etc. So this is a different path. Isocrates tosses several critical charges at the sophists in this. For one, he claims their work paints other teachers in a bad light. He states they don't deliver on their promises, especially when it comes to virtue and justice, and claims they don't have virtue or happiness but claim to teach it. He also critiqued the prices they charged, and accused them of not trusting their students, which is why they asked for fat cash up front. Isocrates claimed they taught the art of discourse incorrectly. They just didn't know from rhetoric and thus couldn't instruct people in it. Isocrates argued the sophists were teaching tricks, not the important stuff like kairos, etc., just parlor tricks as far as speaking and getting people on your side. Question 2. How do Isocrates' thoughts differ from Plato's, and how do his thoughts resemble Plato's? Isocrates claimed one's own ability, which couldn't be gained by studying itself, but could be refined by it, their own practice of creating speech to take advantage of kairos, and a situational awareness, which comes from observing a number of singular occasions, are his key pedagogical principles. Some scholars have argued that Plato's Gorgias is actually a response to Isocrates against the sophist, and there may be some truth there. Speaking practically, Athens was not that big of a place. How many orators were teaching around there? So you can see how there are others who are all about rhetoric, but they did not all necessarily endorse the sophistic approach to it. And while Plato articulated difficulties that rhetoric would continue to face for thousands of years, up to and including now, such as how it can produce only beliefs, not knowledge or certainty, and that it might mislead or flatter the ignorant toward beliefs and actions neither in their best interest nor of that of the state, there's a big question left. What about contingency? What if something, say a situation or a set of circumstances, switched up on you and changed? What about those important issues about which we can never have certain knowledge? So here's where we get to Plato's most famous student, Aristotle. Aristotle, the big dog of ancient rhetoric, the guy who gave us the proofs to get to the truths. A brief biography is in order. Born 384 BCE in Stagiria, which is Macedonia, so he was not an Athenian citizen. In 366 BCE, he entered Plato's academy. In 347 BCE, he left Athens to travel, research botany and biology. In 343 BCE, he was invited by Philip II to tutor Alexander the Great. Sort of a big deal. In 335 BCE, he returned to Athens and founded the Lyceum. In 322 BCE, he left Athens, claiming, quote, "I will not allow Athens to sin twice against philosophy." The first sin, of course, was the execution of Socrates, the real one, who was forced to drink hemlock. Hemlock, of course, being very poisonous. In 322 BCE, Aristotle passed away, living outside of Athens. Aristotle was a beast of a thinker, and worked in a variety of fields. His On Rhetoric is perhaps best read by way of George A. Kennedy's version, and I don't say that just because he was a UNC faculty member. It really is a fantastic translation with good notes. And it was comprised of notes for lectures which he made while teaching at the academy, and completed, insofar as we have the final document, during his second stay in Athens at the Lyceum. This is a huge, important sentence, one which will be crucial in understanding the difference between Plato and Aristotle with regard to rhetoric. Rhetoric is the counterpart of dialectic. So this opens on rhetoric. Counterpart is the big word. Not inferior version, not subpar iteration, not weak version of dialectic, counterpart. In terms of learning from the learned, I want to invoke the words of UNC Communications' own Bill Balthrop, who said, quote, "Part of the importance of Aristotle, beyond what he does in Book 1 of Rhetoric, is that he totally shifts from his teacher, Plato. For Plato, his focus is on the noumenal world, the world of ideas, truth with the big T. But for Aristotle, he argues we have to start with the phenomenal world, the world of senses. This would, of course, make him subject to the critique from Platonists that he, too, is dealing with appearances and not truth, sort of a sophistic position. And this is a significant break. For Aristotle, rhetoric had particular purposes: to help truth and justice prevail, to instruct, to help see both sides of a question, and to engage in self-defense. There are similarities between rhetoric and dialectic. Both seek probable conclusions, both are universal, common to all, not to a particular science, both are methods, not substantive, and both start with opinions as premises. They differ in that rhetoric seeks a popular audience, whereas dialectic is a conversation among experts. Rhetoric's goal is persuasion, while dialectic's goal is criticism. And rhetoric consists of extended discourse or speeches, and dialectic proceeds by question and answer. But again, it's not like Aristotle was all in with other teachers and turning his back on Plato. He believed the framers of rhetoric of his day made major mistakes. Aristotle claimed in On Rhetoric that they have constructed but a small portion of that art. He also felt they focus on the non-essentials, only how to put the judge into a given frame of mind, emotions, and that they say nothing about the substance of rhetoric, the enthymeme. And also, they say nothing about political oratory, but focus instead on forensic oratory. Question 3. What was the unstated premise of the following enthymeme? Dr. Taylor is a medical doctor, so therefore Dr. Taylor has to be a genius. Fully explain your answer in your own words. At this point, using Kairos here, perhaps we should restate Aristotle's definition of rhetoric as described by Kennedy. And remember, there are a bunch of different definitions floating about. That's part of the charm and part of the problem. Rhetoric may be defined as an ability, in each particular case, to see the available means of persuasion. And with means of persuasion, we of course think of logos, ethos, and pathos. We've talked about these before, but they come up a lot, and will continue to do so. And indeed, Aristotle did talk about them in On Rhetoric. The first book of the text establishes these terms, and also moves forward into logos a bit by discussing what we call syllogisms and enthymemes, which Aristotle believed were the heart of rhetoric. Aristotle also talks about, again, the three types of rhetoric: forensic, or judicial, deliberative, or legislative, and epidictic, which was ceremonial rhetoric. But since we've mentioned it a couple times now, let's close out this lesson by answering the question, what exactly is an enthymeme? And let's also answer the question, why did Aristotle dig them so much? To answer these, we have to address one other question first, and that is, what is a syllogism? See, an enthymeme is a type of syllogism. So to learn enthymemes, you have to know what a syllogism is. A syllogism is a deductive logical form. Remember, deductive goes from general to specific knowledge. In a syllogism, we make a conclusion based on two or more propositions which we take as true. We call these premises. The classic Aristotle version is as follows. All humans are mortal. Socrates is human. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. So, break it down. All humans are mortal is the major premise. Socrates is human would be the minor premise. And at last, therefore, Socrates is mortal is the conclusion. So we have a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. But in an enthymeme, you could remove one of those premises, and it would still work as an argument, even though it would be technically incomplete. For Aristotle, this was a big part of rhetoric, and a huge part of argument. And once you learn it, you'll start searching for unspoken premises all the time. There are a couple ways to make these. The first is just excluding a premise. The other is removing a sign, as opposed to a fact. In this case, in accordance with Aristotle, a sign is something suggesting the existence of a fact. It's easy to get lost in the weeds here, but here's a good example. Dana hasn't left the bed all week, so Dana's lazy. We don't know if that's the reason they're in bed. What if they're ill? What if they're being overworked? How can we tell Dana's lazy from that? As an audience, we may fill in the gaps here. These can be powerful. Here's one example. It's a typical Franklin Street restaurant. gross and filled with loud people. So people who would think that way would hear the typical part of the sentence and fill in the gaps, and perhaps agree to dismiss the place outright. The unstated premise being that Franklin Street restaurants are bad or annoying. Enthymemes can be visual too. This is very big in advertising, but you can also see it in road signs and the like. Think of a windy road sign. It implies you might get into a wreck if you drive poorly or don't use your lights or pay attention to your surroundings. As an audience member, you fill in that missing premise. So these can be very useful in communication, but they can also be absolute minefields, and they can take your argument apart or cause it to become faulty. Let's talk about a poorly crafted enthymeme. And again, once you start thinking this way, it's hard to stop. You'll be forever on the lookout for faulty premises or an assumption which isn't true. Returning to the numbers discussion, here's a math-related enthymeme. I don't like that one math professor. I hate math. Well, the missing premise is pretty apparent. In this case, math professors are bad, or all math professors are unlikable. Does that mean you hate math itself? I met somebody who claimed her friend had their life ruined by Facebook. She logged on to find out about her boyfriend, and her boyfriend was cheating on her. She argued that people should get off Facebook because Facebook ruins lives. But in that case, where the unstated premise was Facebook made this happen, we can see that that premise was untrue. Nobody at Facebook was making that one guy be a bad boyfriend. That's not exactly a great business model. It was just bad logic. In fact, at the time I wanted to argue, didn't Facebook sort of help their life? So even though a well-crafted enthymeme can efficiently save time and make communication more direct, in this case I was not persuaded by the enthymeme. It just wasn't convincing. You can also think of this in terms of political slogans. I'm with her. It's morning again in America. Yes, we can. Make America great again. Not me, us. All those have heavy enthymeme-like qualities. There's premises which are unstated. You'll see that a lot. So there you have it. A definitive change in the direction of rhetoric, and a shift in thought which echoes to this day. In the next lesson, we'll go back to the future with Bitzer's rhetorical situation, and also talk about George W. Bush's speech to the nation on September 11th. As you go over them, think about what you've learned in terms of proofs, species of rhetoric, kairos, and enthymemes and syllogisms, as well as the audience and the goals of the texts. See you during office hours, and be sure to check in with me this week. Have a good one.